Hey, I'm Alex Ratcliffe from Board Game Co., and this past weekend I sat down to play a game, a solo game, that I wanted to dive into, and it had one of the worst rulebooks I've read in a long time. I sat there, I struggled, I probably stood for 45 minutes trying to go through it and figure things out. Eventually I set everything up and just started playing, hoping that maybe it would start making more sense as I went through it. But no, things were missing, things were not clear. The game seems like it should be a simple experience to go through, and yet I got to a point where I broke my teeth enough that I gave up. I read the rules for half an hour, played it for 20-25 minutes, and eventually moved on and completely gave up. And then I sat down to write up the draft and the games for this video, because I've been meaning to do a video on worst rulebooks, hardest experiences for a while now, and this game is the tipping point for me finally doing it. Spoiler, it will be included in this list. But this is, as you saw in the title, as you saw in the thumbnail, as you got the impression in the past 30 seconds if you had this on autoplay, this is a video of the 10 worst rulebooks I've ever gone through. And there are 14 caveats to that, as there usually are in most of my content. The caveats, and I'll go through them. It's going to be rambling a bit. The good news is there's timestamps down below in case you want to skip all the rambling and go straight to the games. In fact, if you don't even want to watch the video, all the games are listed in there, which is great, because some people think that means you won't watch the video, but that actually means that you'll find the one on this list that you disagree with. You'll vehemently jump to that point, so you can write, so you can see what I say, then you can write in the description, how dare I? It actually is a really simple and easy rulebook, and it should have been ridiculously easy, and I'm stupid, and I'm a nincompoop who uses the word nincompoop. Those are all fun things. It's great. It increases engagement. It's good for the channel. It's good for you. We all get a little bit off our chest. When I said there was rambling, I meant it. But a few notes about the rambling stuff. First of all, this is going to be biased towards games I own or particularly bad experiences I've had. The reason for that is because I can look around my collection at games I've owned and be like, yeah, that was a tough rulebook to get through. And/or games that I have particularly bad experiences because they're gone and they were so bad that they were memorable. There's going to be a lot of middling experiences along the way that I've played and I've gone through and I didn't keep and I forgot about them, and that is what it is. Additionally, there's no prototypes in this list. I don't care how bad your rulebook is if you're a prototype. If you're a prototype, something I've played for the channel, you might have the worst rulebook that I may have even made mention of in a video, but as long as you're a prototype, you get a free pass. I don't expect prototypes to have the level of rules that a final copy should. They're constantly in development, they're being tweaked, graphical design. There's a million different reasons why a prototype rulebook can be a struggle and has been a struggle in a lot of cases. But they're not going to be included on this list. This list is only final copies. Additionally, this won't have some particularly what's infamous games with bad rulebooks. If I haven't played it, if I haven't struggled through it myself, it won't be on this list. A good example there is going to be Myth. Possibly one of the most famous games with bad rulebooks I've ever heard of, to the point that Richard Ham, Rado Runs Through, went on a 15-minute rant against the rules in a video, and it's a bad rulebook, the first edition, before they cleaned it up. But I never read it, so it's not really relevant. Machina Arcana, which is on this table, is a game that I particularly enjoyed the rulebook and thought it was very easy to get through, but that's because I only ever read the 3rd edition rules. I never dove into the original rules, the rules people say were unclear. I've only ever dove into this game in the newest rule set, so I love the game, but I never struggled to get to the game that I love. It was easy for me because I had the newest rules. Jamaica. Jamaica's a game that's also not going to be on this list. Jamaica's a game that has a very, very bad rule book in the sense that it is this unfolding giant map that makes referencing things impossible. It's a nightmare when you want to reference something, trying to fold this over on a giant table and look at it. It's a pain. It's annoying. It's frustrating. But the actual game is very easy to learn, and so the learn was pretty easy. It's just referencing that's frustrating. So when I say bad rulebooks, I don't necessarily even mean bad rulebooks. I mean games that I had to struggle and really break my teeth on to get to. Which is why there are a lot of games. If you Google bad rulebooks, as I do, to fill in any gaps or things I had forgotten about, there was one I had forgotten about. I was like, yeah, that was a tough rulebook. But when you Google bad rulebooks, there are a lot of games out there that tend to be listed as things like the Cavernas, the Feasts for Odins, a lot of these heavy, longer games that I don't actually think the rulebooks are that bad, but they are heavier and have a lot of information. If it wasn't a struggle for me, it's not going to be on this list, and the reverse is true as well. It might be a particularly easy game to learn, but if it was a struggle for me, it's going to be on this list. Like games like Vinos. Vinos is not going to be on this list because Vinos, I remember breaking my teeth on the very first edition rules way back in the day. I played the first edition of Vinos when in my first year of gaming, and I remember it was particularly hard to get through that. But it was also a very, very heavy game in my first year of gaming, and so I don't know if it would be the same struggle now, and so again, I didn't include that. Which means with all that rambling and exclusions and caveats and things like that out of the way, we're still not going to start this list, but I will start with 2 bonus picks. And they are bonus picks for a reason, and I'll talk about those reasons. The first is Chaos in the Old World. Chaos in the Old World has a rulebook that I think is fairly clear. I think it's very clear. I have no complaints about the clarity of teaching the game. The reason it's on this list is because the Guild of the something guild, I don't remember the name, I'll have a link down below, but there is a rulebook from a website that does this. I can't remember the name of it, but they basically take these rulebooks and they make them shorter and more accessible. And they took the 35 pages of Chaos in the Old World and they distilled it down to 2 pages of rules that I really believe cover everything you need to know. Maybe it was 4 pages, I don't remember. But they took a 35-page long rulebook and distilled it down to 4 pages. 2 pages, double-sided, back-to-back. 4 pages of comprehensible rules that will teach you how to play the game. I don't really fault the rulebook for Chaos in the Old World. I think it has the information you need and it taught me the game. But it is also true that someone else did it in 4 pages when it took them 35. And so it's not really a bad rulebook. It's not a game I struggled to get through. But it is notable just how wide that gap was. And they do this for a lot of games, but that was the biggest gap I've ever personally seen from the original rulebook to the revised rulebook. Mage Knight is the second game that's not on this list. Mage Knight is going to be not on this list because of the fact that, for me, Mage Knight is a game that I do struggle to get through, and I do struggle to play it. But I also don't know if I can fault the clarity. It's long, sure, but it does do a great job with a walkthrough of how to play the game, and I've never really struggled with the how to play of Mage Knight. There's just a lot that's going on there. There's a lot of information. Is it pretty clear? Yes. Do I struggle to get through it? Not particularly. And so I'm not willing to put it on this list, but it did come close. It was on my first 10, and then I was like, I don't feel comfortable putting Mage Knight on this list when I actually think the rulebook is pretty clear. Similarly to Chaos in the Old World, if the rulebook is clear, if it did the job, if it gave me the information I need, I can't really fault it. I mean, I could fault it, but that's not the point of this list. For being long. Being long, having too much information, having too much, that doesn't bother me as much. It's when I really struggle to learn to play a game that those are the games that made their way onto this list. Some of these games I still own, some of these games I'm getting rid of, some of these games I never kept because I wasn't going to. And let's start with the first one, number 10. Number 10 on this list is a game called Mill 1049. Mill 1049 is a game that I played a long time ago. A fairly long time ago. I don't remember exactly how long, but I want to say it was my first year or so of gaming, not the probably first 2 years of gaming. But it's the first game, the very first game that I ever gave up on. I never played Mill 1049, and it's stuck in my head as a game that I don't remember what it was about. At this point, I don't even remember what it's about. It's a 6.6 on Board Game Geek. I looked it up again just for the sake of this video, but it's stuck with me for all these years. A game that I've never played stuck with me for so long because it was the first game I ever gave up on. Not a game that I read the rulebook and didn't get around to playing, a game that I tried to play, and I was like, this is just not happening. This is not clear, this is just all over the place. It is the worst rulebook. I was going to say it's the worst rulebook I've ever read. I don't know if that's true. It is the first game I ever completely gave up on because I couldn't figure out what the way to play the game was. The rules, nuances, the details. I don't remember what it was that I didn't figure out. I just remember I read through it. I read through it again. I set it up. I tried playing it, and I got to a point that I eventually gave up. I didn't even look to Board Game Geek as a resource because I didn't really use Board Game Geek as actively in that sense. I used it, but I didn't really think of it as a resource for rules, for FAQs, for details, for files, all these things and tools that you can get your hands on Board Game Geek. I didn't use it for those things at the time, and so Mill 1049 is the first game that I ever gave up on, and therefore the number 10 on this list. My number 9. My number 9 is The World of Smog, Rise of Moloch, and this one I do have. This is a fantastic game, and the reason this is my number 9, the reason this is lower on my list, honestly, now I'm thinking about it, Mill 1049 should have been lower down this list because I did order this mostly in how difficult the rules were. Mill 1049 is a little out of order, apologies for that. But The World of Smog, Rise of Moloch is actually one of my least offenders on this list, and the reason for that is because I was able to play The World of Smog just fine. I dove into this game, I read the rules, I set it up, I played it. I love this game, by the way. It's in my top 100. I don't remember exactly where, but it's fairly high up. But The World of Smog, Rise of Moloch is a game that the actual rules are fairly short, coming in at roughly 8 to 10 pages, something like that. Maybe more. It might be a little more. I don't remember exactly. Maybe it's 8 pages, double-sided. It's not that hard to get through is what my point is. The rules are fairly clear. It's fairly easy to comprehend. All good things across the board, except for one giant thing. once you start playing it, you start realizing the amount of things that are missing. Meaning it's an easy game to learn, it's an easy game to walk into, it's an easy game to play, but you start playing the game and you're like, well, what happens in that situation? And how does that interact with that? And does the fire spread in this round? What happens when I do this? There was a lot of questions around the interactions of the game. There were a lot of questions around how things play out, and the FAQs start flooding in as you start playing through the game. The good news is Command has released an FAQ that's online that covers most of what you need to know. The rest you can find in the forums. It's a game that you will have to walk into being prepared. I mean, my recommendation for this game is I think it's a great game. I think you should get it. I think you should play it. I think it's fantastic. Caveats, it has to be a genre that you like. But once you do so, you have to be prepared for the fact that either you'll be referencing the FAQ as these situations come up and print that out before you start, or alternatively, just be prepared to make house rules as you go. Now, it's a head-to-head game, so you'll have to figure out the rules, how do you house roll in whose favor, what are you going to do. Those are all details you can figure out. But be comfortable with the fact that the game is very good. I like it a lot. It's very well rated, but you do have to be prepared to house rule or reference things on a regular basis as you go through the experience. But again, actually getting it set up, starting to play, very easy. It's pretty easy. It's not a lot going on. It's just the exceptions that tend to get in your way. My number 8 is Keyflower. Keyflower is a game that I didn't so much give up on as I deprioritized. Keyflower is a game with a very, very dry rulebook, the rulebook. And there's a lot of games that have this, but again, I went specifically for the games I was challenged by, the games where I read rules and was like, I'm gonna put you on the back burner and deal with you later. And Keyflower certainly fit into that genre, or niche, or whatever category you're calling it. Keyflower is supposedly a great game. It's top 100, and it's a game where I read the rules, started reading the rules, going through the rules, and then just found them incredibly dry and hard to get through. I couldn't visualize what was going on, how the game operated, and multiple times I have started this rulebook only to get a few pages in and just put it back down and played another game, learnt another game instead. It's not that I ever officially gave up on Keyflower, but I just kept postponing when I would get this game played. And then eventually, one day, I don't know, 3 months ago, someone else taught me the game. The game is ridiculously easy. It is a really easy game to teach. It's not a hard game to learn at all. The rules managed to just put me off the experience time and time again, but Keyflower is actually not a hard game to get into. I just found the rules to not be great as far as giving me the feeling of how the game plays. And so it's a game that I deprioritized and pushed off time and time again, despite it being a fantastic experience. By the way, Keyflower is fantastic. I absolutely adore it. I am sad. I'm mad. I'm mad at them. Okay, they're bad R&D games. I'm mad. I didn't play the game that I should have played, and it's a fantastic experience. I've since picked up the expansions because of how good the game is, and now I want to dive into it with the expansions and play it. And I will sit there and go through the rules because it's not the worst. It's just very dry in its implementation. This is one of those games that I kind of wanted to be a deluxe edition and everything else, because in addition to the rules, I don't like the graphic design, the components, any of the stuff. I just really like the game behind it. That's number 8 is Keyflower. My number 7 is Wild Assent. Wild Assent, which is a game that I really, really like this game. Wild Assent is a fantastic experience that I really enjoy. It's one of those few campaign games that manages to stick around despite being a campaign game, because it's 10 games long, the campaign is achievable, it's not too overbearing, and there's a lot of amazing gameplay in here. That said, it is a final production game that when I learnt the game, I learnt it by basically reading the rules, diving into it, and then messaging the designer the questions not every 10 minutes. I messaged once a day. I'd compile a list of questions and then send it over to him, which is great. I had access to him. It was great, but not everyone does have access to the designer of the game. And so my experience diving into Wild Assent was certainly cleaner and smoother than a lot of other people's experience, because I was able to directly ask questions before Board Game Geek had all the answers, before this game was widely available for anyone to dive into. And so I love Wild Assent, but it had that rules clarity. Now, I did make sure to note that in my review. I made sure to note that you will have to be comfortable making judgment calls, as I did. Despite having answers available to me the next day, I didn't have answers that day, and so I dove into Wild Assent, and I similar to the World of Smog, Rise of Moloch, it was not a hard game to actually learn the sequencing. It was not a hard game to dive into and actually play, but you had to be comfortable house ruling any number of different things. Now, the upside of Wild Assent compared to World of Smog is the fact that as a co-op experience, or in my case, as most of my plays were solo, I didn't care about house ruling whatever I wanted. There was no conflict, there was no discussion, what if we're ruling this way or the other, what if I've just given you the edge? It's my solo game, I'm enjoying it, I'm having fun, I don't care, I will just simply rule based on what I think adds the most fun to my experience. If it makes it easier, the more easy than I won't do it. If it makes it too hard than I want, I won't do it. I'll self-balance the game around my own understanding of the rules while I wait for clarity, in my case from the designer, in your case it might be looking up the rules online. In general, when I play games, I don't like looking up rules on a regular basis. I find it interrupts the flow, both for others and for myself, and so most of the time, I'll look up a rule the first time, and then I realize that there are going to be multiple instances of me looking up rules. I get to a point where I'm just like, I'm just going to decide, and I'll take notes and look them up later. I'm not going to keep breaking the flow in order to find out the right way of doing things. I'm here to have fun, and it's my goal to make sure that I have fun. Wild Ascent's a fantastic game. They have a second edition, or Levon Rising, coming out with everything updated or whatnot. I hope that means the rulebook will be updated, not for my sake, I now know how to play the game, but for whoever else dives into this game, because I have seen enough people complaining with the rules that I think it is marring the experiences of others. And I don't want them to have a marred experience, because I want them to enjoy the game that is Wild Ascent. My number 6. My number 6 is a game that I never actually played. And it's Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe by Portal Games. I first got the first edition way back in the day, that elongated Z-Man box. I got that game, and I tried reading the rulebook, and I kind of gave up on it. Not really officially gave up, it's more like the Keyflower version, where I was like, this is a little bit more painful than I signed up for. I will push this train down the road, and I will come back to it at a later date. A later date never really arrived. In fact, eventually I got rid of Robinson Crusoe, but then they came out with the 4th edition, the newer square box from Portal Games, and I was like, I'll try it again. It's got to have a better rulebook. Now, to be fair, it does have a better rulebook, but I never overly made my way into the rulebook. The rulebook was still long, it was still detailed, and I still had that slight PTSD around the first rulebook, and so I dove into the rulebook a few times and never really got around to actually sitting down and playing it. And then I did what any good addict does, and I backed the 3rd edition, the newest version, the Deluxe Pledge on GameFound. I backed that because they had a learn-to-play sequence, a kind of Jaws of the Lion style introductory thing where you can go through the game and play scenario after scenario as it introduces you to core concepts. And I thought Jaws of the Lion was a fantastic way to learn to play Gloomhaven, and so if you're promising me that in Robinson Crusoe, one of the top 100 games and an amazing solo experience supposedly, well, I was very intrigued. And so I went ahead and decided to get my hands on that to try that instead. 4th edition had already left my collection by that point, with the fear that I would never actually get it played. And so now I have on the way, I guess, not really on the way, but eventually on the way, I have the newest edition of Robinson Crusoe, the deluxe whatever it is, hoping I'll dive into that one and giving it a shot. And if the learn to play works for me, then great. And if it doesn't work for me, it'll leave my collection, as other games do when they don't work for me for one reason or another. And that's my number 6, a game that I never played, kept kicking that can down the road, and eventually I'm still hoping that I will get it played. My number 5. My number 5 is a game that's no longer here, and that's Etherfields. Etherfields by Awakened Realms. And Etherfields is the only Awakened Realms title on this list. Maybe I'll talk about that a bit more before we continue onwards. But Etherfields is a game that I walked into the experience knowing the rules were bad. And that sometimes helps, by the way. Sometimes that sets expectations. Sometimes I know that the game is supposed to have bad rules, and so that's good, because I'm not walking in expecting clarity. I'm walking in expecting to break my teeth, and it changes the mindset. Happiness. Happiness is reality minus expectations. If you expect a lot and you get very little, your happiness is negative. If you expect very little and get a lot, your happiness is positive. In the case of Etherfields, I expected very little and got less than what I expected. The rulebook was a pain to go through. It was not that clear. Now, I will give them some degree of credence in the sense that other game systems, like let's say Unsettled is a great example of a game that has a fairly clear rulebook, but at the end of the day, when you're trying to teach a rulebook based on a concept, but you have to apply that concept to modular things that will change up the concept, it does make it harder to teach that game. When I learn a game like Unsettled that I think is a very clear rulebook, but then I dive into a new planet, I'm trying to mentally merge a rule set and the variables to that rule set all at once in my first experience. And Etherfields very much has that. It has the idea that they're trying to teach you a game, but they're also going to throw you into the unknown and throw you into these modules and dreams and sequences that are different from the core standard concept of the rules. And so I do give them credence for the fact that it's a difficult challenge to begin with. That said, credence or not, it was a brutal rulebook, and so I very quickly gave up and moved to what I had been recommended as the go-to guide, a 4 or 5 page guide someone else had printed out as far as how to go through the experience, from setting up the initial cards you have in your packs and getting it all structured, directly to diving into the world around you. And I thought it was a significantly easier entry point, to the point that I've played through hours and hours of Etherfields content, tens of hours of Etherfields, going through multiple dream sequences, 10, 11, 12 dream sequences and whatnot, and I've never properly finished the Awakened Realms rulebook for Etherfields. I've run by on the guide, and I've occasionally referenced the rulebook when I had a question. The rulebook for Etherfields was not the clearest to me. It was definitely a messy experience, to the point that it made number 5 on this list. And this is where, before we move on to number 4, I will mention no other Awakened Realms has currently made that title, that list for me. And the reason is because I haven't yet had that level of issue. Nemesis was a bit of a struggle to get through, but not overly burdensome. The Great Wall, I complained about the rulebook in my review, but it wasn't that the game was hard to understand. The rulebook was actually very easy to go through and understand the game. It just, there were needless and stupid mistakes and lack of illustrations. It was a thing where the rulebook was totally fine, but it could have been so much better with minimal amounts of effort, and there were some small stupid things along the way. But none of the other Awakened Realms games I've played have actually gotten in the way of me enjoying the experience, which is the main thing I considered for this list. Did you get in the way of me being able to play that game that I hopefully enjoy so much? Number 4 is Black Rose Wars. And Black Rose Wars definitely got in the way of me enjoying the game, to the point that even with the 1.5 rules, I still found this one to be a chore to get through, needing an amazing player aid, a community-printed player aid, to even give you a chance at understanding the game. And I've talked about the difficulty of the Black Rose Wars rules in the past, and I have had those comments, which I'm sure I'll have on this video with certain titles, of it's not that hard, it's really, really easy to get through, and I'm like, you're right, it is. The rules, the concept of Black Rose Wars is not a hard game to understand. The sequencing is fairly procedural. There's a few steps as far as maintenance, followed by just going ahead and taking your turns, and your turns are not that complicated. There's a sequence of you can combine 2 different actions in different ways, and you're going to be programming your spells. It's really not a complicated game. And yet the rules managed to make it complicated. The rules managed to make it an experience that we had to struggle through for an hour plus trying to figure out how to play with somebody who had walked in prepared. I had read through the rulebook, someone else had read through the rulebook, we both were walking semi-prepared, and when I say semi-prepared, it's because we thought we were prepared, and we clearly weren't. But then once we got the player aids, printed them out, went through that, it suddenly became a lot simpler to dive into it. Black Rose Wars is an excellent game. It's a game that is a lot of fun to actually start slinging those spells at one another and going through the fun and the chaos that the game is meant to have. But combines some degrees of fiddliness in the ways the decks are run, and the ways you set up your opening decks, and the ways you sequence your deck building. There are some areas of fiddliness in the experience, but more importantly, it's a bad rulebook, making small degrees of fiddliness very magnified and making the experience harder to get through with any degree of confidence that you are playing it correctly. Even to this day, having gone through the rules multiple times now to play, and I've also played Black Rose Wars Rebirth, rulebook was better, but also prototypes, so not the topic of this video. But even today, Black Rose Wars is a game that if I sat down to play with you, there's a decent chance you'd be able to be like, you're doing that wrong. It's entirely possible. My learning of the game has been a combination of reading the rules, playing the game, getting the player aids, playing the game, then reading the rules again and playing the game, and hoping that by now I have a good idea of how to actually go through all the sequences without any things that get in the way of enjoying the experience. Now, the good news is I no longer have things that get in the way of enjoying the experience. At the end of the day, the rules now are clear in a way that they weren't back then. But it still very much makes this list because it was something that I had to break my teeth on. My number 3, another game that's not here, is Reichbusters. Reichbusters from Mythic Games is a game that I did not enjoy the rulebook. Now, there were mistakes in the rulebooks, to be clear. There were mistakes, there were lack of clarities, there were a bunch of things you have to look up. Reichbusters is a game that, to me, was a disappointment on a lot of fronts. And I think the game is good, to be clear. It's not a level of good that I wanted to keep diving into. It's one of those games that I still hope that a Reichbusters 2.0 with a revised this, that, or the other will potentially give me the experience I want, because it had concepts I really enjoyed, it had miniatures that were amazing, it had a lot of fun things to go through, some things to manage, but then a lot of tediousness in the gameplay, but more importantly, things in the rules that made it hard to actually understand if I was playing correctly, how I was playing correctly, and going through the experience. The rules in general were just hard to get through. Learning the game was fine. Same idea as some of these games like Wild Assent or Rise of Moloch, where once you're done learning the game, you have a good idea. Not as good as these. There were issues even just learning the game. But then once you get through those things, once you kind of realize that some aspects are contained in this rulebook, some aspects are contained in this rulebook, some aspects are out of sequence, again, there were more problems, but you can get up and running, but then the questions start coming. Then you start flipping through the rulebooks desperately, and again, you get to a certain point, or at least I got to a certain point, where you start making frequent house rules because you don't want to be flipping through the rulebook every 4.5 minutes when you're playing a board game. And so I went through the experience that way, and eventually got most of the things, and I would say, to their credit, I would say most things, not all things, most things are in the rulebook. Just a lot of them are out of order, a lot of them are poorly structured and where you should be able to find that thing, and they're not necessarily intuitive to read through. And then even things like the equipment and all the stuff on the board, there's the amount of details and information that you had to constantly reference. Ratchbusters was definitely a game that was very hard to break my teeth on, that was very hard to get up and tabled. I did up and table it, and then I played it again, and then I played it again, and that's when the gameplay started becoming the issue over the actual rules itself. But Ratchbusters was a game that was begging for an updated rule set that they may have by now. I know that they've been very on top of putting out errata cards and rules and different things like that, so they may well have those updated rules. I wouldn't know because it eventually left my collection as a game that I really liked the promise of, but I didn't like it enough to keep diving into it. I have one particular person who wrote off my entire channel, who's like, he's in like comments and other videos, he's like, oh, you don't like Reichbusters, I can't ever trust anything you say, and to his credit, he hasn't watched my other videos since then, so at least he's consistent. But that is how things work. My number 2 is a game that, this is a tricky one to cover, because this is Too Many Bones. Too Many Bones is a game that I only have this because I can't carry the entire trophy just over here, that would be insane, but Too Many Bones is a game that I almost gave up on. Multiple times I almost gave up on, because the rulebook was incredibly frustrating to go through. I found the rulebook to not be clear. Before I go further, it's worth noting that Too Many Bones as a product line has had multiple rulebooks, multiple streamlined, updated rulebooks. And so for all of you who are like, Alex, that rulebook is incredibly easy and clear and this and that, your opinion doesn't count here unless you read the original rulebooks, just for context. So if you read the original rulebooks, your opinion counts a lot. If you didn't, you'd have to find someone who did and tried learning the games on those before criticizing my take here. I mean, you can criticize me all you want, just that's the context you need. But anyways, Too Many Bones. Too Many Bones is a game that the original rulebook that I read, and I don't know if I read the first version, it may have been 1.1 or whatever it is, they've had a whole bunch by now, but I read one of the earlier ones before it was further updated, and I just found the rules to be incredibly hard to get through. Things weren't clear, examples weren't clear, the general idea of how to play the game, how to set things up wasn't clear, the concept of the battle queue, the concept of the mechs and the baddies, and all these different things that they're throwing into the system in front of you, none of it made sense to me. Now, there are a lot of tutorials out there you can check, and those certainly did help to a degree, but it's a game that, like many others before, I struggled through the rules, and then I gave up and pushed it off. I struggled through the rules, and I gave up and pushed it off again. I struggled through the rules again, and I gave up and pushed it down the road, and then eventually one day, I set everything up, I was going to get it played, because Too Many Bones, unlike many of these other games, by all accounts, seemed like a game that I really needed to play. Games like Keyflower are games that, there's a million euros out there, I don't need to play this one, I could pull out another euro and play that, but Too Many Bones, something about it screamed that it was unique, that it was different, that it was special, in a variety of ways, from the way it approached your upgrading, from the way it dealt with the battle queue, from the general type of game it is. It's a genre that I tend to love, and powers and abilities galore. This game seems to be up my alley, and I'm glad I persevered, because it is one of the best games I have in my collection. It was in my top 10 games of all time this year, and it's such a delight to sit down and play the game, but it was a game I had to struggle through. It was a game that even to this day, I don't find the referencing, they have an index to their credit, but I don't find referencing things to be that easy. There are still times where I have questions and the lack of clarity and uncertainty, and will play this game wrong. That absolutely does happen. But at least I got to a point where I play the game, because playing the game is immensely enjoyable. It is such a ridiculously good experience, but one that I did have to break my teeth on along the way. Now, for context, I have since read one of the more updated rulebooks. The last time I dove into this, I hadn't played it in a year, and so I quickly read through the rulebook, and I don't know if it's the fact that it's the updated rulebook, I don't know if it's the fact that I walked in knowing how to play the game, but everything seemed a lot clearer to me. I think it's likely a combination of both. Knowing how to play a game does make a rulebook easier to understand, and it was a newer version of the rulebook, which definitely makes the game easier to understand as well. But the original Too Many Bones, or whatever rulebook I read from the original Too Many Bones, had an amazing game hidden behind a rule set that did not make enough sense to me personally. My number one is a game that's not staying in my collection. It's the game that absolutely inspired this video in the moment. Again, I've had this video on my to-do for a while. Half these titles were on that list. But this is the number one, the game that I played this week that really didn't work for me. Now, it's worth noting that there's a degree of frustration at the experience at this particular game. But it's frustration, and it's number one because of how recent it is. And that is Ratcatcher. I don't necessarily think this is a bad game. I don't necessarily think it's the worst rulebook. I do think that it's a game that I am personally, in the current moment, very frustrated by because, like Etherfields before, I actually walked into this one with my expectations set. I mentioned already that happiness is reality minus expectations. My expectations were low. Jeremy Howard, in a video I did with him, the top 10 disappointing experiences of 2021, he put Ratcatcher in there, referencing the bad rulebook. And I was like, this is a solo game, and it's a solo game that I know Crackle Up loves and has played. It can't be that hard to understand it. If Jesse can understand it, I can definitely understand it. Little dig there for funsies. But I don't know how to play this game. I don't. I sat there and I suffered through the rulebook and I read the rules, and things started to be unclear from the very get-go. Various icons or how things work were just not covered. Things were just listed with a lack of clarity around how they operate. The turn structure was listed with a lack of clarity. The priority system of the rats was listed with a lack of clarity. The way rats activate, the way anything happens in this game, the way setup happens, the way you put down different markers. There are images that do not align with what the text is saying. This is a game that eventually I just started moving forward, putting things down on the board and setting it up with the best possible understanding I could. Even the introduction to this moment, I was going to say to this day, but it's only been a few days. To this day in Ratcatcher, the very first listing of what you get in the rules, I'm not sure if I'm missing 10 different components or whatever it is, 10 different tokens, trap tokens, or whether they just listed them incorrectly. Given everything else that was wrong, I'm inclined to believe that they listed things incorrectly as opposed to tokens are missing, because you're supposed to have like 17 trap tokens, and I have 3. Maybe they're missing, maybe not. I wouldn't know because so many other things were wrong in the rules. So eventually I got to a point where I sat down and I set it all up and I put it on the table and I got ready to play it. And I started going through things, and the game seems fine. It's a management activity of the various rats on the board of trying to gather this magical cheese that will power you up. I really like the concept of that. The idea that you can slowly improve your own board, how many dice you roll, how much movement you have, the various actions you're taking, how well you roll. The idea that you're slowly powering things up on your own board is a lot of fun as you're collecting the cheese and denying the rats these cheese, understanding your priorities that the rats will eventually be gathering the cheese themselves, but you have to make sure that you get the cheese before they get the cheese. You stay alive and you take out the nemesis rat before they take you out. There's 2 win conditions, there's 2 loss conditions. The game seems like a fun little optimization solo puzzle, the kind of experience that I typically like. With the caveat that there's a lot of dice rolling. A lot of dice rolling as you roll through the dice, as you roll to attack rats, as you roll for the traps. So there is a lot of dice rolling in the game that would take away from just how much I enjoyed it. But I have no clue how the game works. I don't know what you can buy. You have these as you kill rats, you can trade in their bodies to eventually buy things. I don't even know what those things are that you can buy. I don't know how any number of things operate, that even with setting it up and just saying, I'll just get through it, I'll just power through it. I couldn't power through it. I am hopeful that Ratcatcher comes out with a 2nd edition rulebook. I'm hopeful that, I believe, if you look at ratings on Board Game Geek, and trust me, I did. After playing it, I eventually went online to see, because at this point, whenever I have a game like this nowadays, the struggle nowadays is, do I either go online and download the newest fan-made rulebook that someone put together, do I try to find answers to my FAQs, or do I just give up entirely? And I'm giving up entirely, because I did find a fan-printed rulebook, and I started reading it, and I realized I was already so frustrated with the experience that I didn't want to set it up and dive into it more. And so it's one that I'm passing on from. And then combined with the dice. The dice was the other factor, that there was enough rolling dice and trying to take down the rats that I was like, there's also a lot of luck here. Don't get me wrong, a lot of other games, a lot of other solo experiences have a decent degree of luck, but I was like, I would rather sit down and play Warp's Edge. I would rather sit down and play Under Falling Skies. I'd rather sit down and play a dozen other solo experiences that have dice rolling and have mitigation and luck and management over continuing to struggle through this one and hope that the game on the other end of the tunnel is for me or not. I don't know. I think that there's a decent game here. I think there's a promising game here. I think if you like solo experiences, you should download the fan-printed rulebook. Do not even touch this rulebook at all. Just skip it entirely. You'll be doing yourself a favor. You'll be doing the designer a favor. I don't like attacking indie publishers, and it's not meant to be an attack, but this is a game that needed to have its rulebook go through some degree of blind testing before this was released to the general public. The theme, the atmosphere, the style of game here, I think that it is a shame that it had to go through a barrier that will make a lot of people, and from the Board Game Geek ratings, it seems like there are a lot of people who are in the same category as myself, people who want to experience the game behind it, but just grew frustrated with the blockers along the way. And so my number one, and again, it's unfairly number one, it's just because it's most recent, is unfortunately the Ratcatcher. A game that seems promising, but I'm unfortunately not going to be tabling. And that's it. These are 10 games, 10 experiences, plus like 10 other things I talked about and rambling and who knows what, about different things along the way for rule books, for access to games, for barriers to entry. There are a lot of games that are amazing, and there are a lot of rule books that are subpar. There are a lot, by the way, you may have noticed, a good 2/3 of this list does have Kickstarter games as the thing in common between them, and that is something we will see. Kickstarter, for all the many things I will praise about it and for what it does, there are also downsides, and one of those downsides does seem to be sometimes rulebooks tend to be worse, which is such a shame because you have an entire pool. If you are a creator, if you are someone designing a game, you have a giant pool of people who backed your game. You can easily put out your final rulebook and say, hey everyone, this is the final rulebook, please review it if you want, go through it, any clarities, any whatever, and by all means let us know. You will guaranteed have some degree of people who go through that rulebook. Not every mistake will be caught because sometimes you need to have the game in front of you before you realize how something wasn't clear. But you will get a lot of things caught that you didn't need to ever let be an issue. Take advantage of the crowdfunding that you engaged in. Crowdfund your rulebook. Offer people a little like $25 reward or pledge manager credit for every mistake they find. It'll be the cheapest way you can ensure that people actually enjoy and love your game, and you don't have people attacking it on the forums, attacking in reviews, saying that this game was a struggle to get through. This game was hard to learn. And there's rule writing services out there as well. There's a variety of people out there who write rule books, and they do so with the knowledge and experience behind them. That will cost you a little bit extra. It may or may not cost you more than $25 a person for every mistake, depending on how bad your rule book is. Bad games exist. That's part of life, and that's okay. Bad games will exist. It's just a shame when good games are hidden behind bad rulebooks. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. If there's any particularly negative experience you've had, a rulebook that really stopped you from enjoying the game, let me know in the comments down below. I'm curious which ones of mine were complete breezes for you, and I'm curious which ones of yours were something that didn't get in the way of me. At the end of the day, sometimes there are bad rulebooks, and sometimes there's just incompatibilities between certain people and certain rulebooks. In any case, have a good one.